Why is my mother laughing? Alexander froze at the doorway. 4 months, the most powerful woman in the Whitmore family had barely spoken. She had stopped attending dinners. Stopped answering visitors. Even the doctors couldn't bring back the woman she used to be. But now, there she was. Laughing. Not with a doctor. Not with a therapist. Not with family. She was sitting in her luxurious London living room, laughing with the woman Alexander had hired to clean his house. His maid. Alexander's face hardened. Grace, what exactly have you been doing with my mother? The room suddenly went silent. Grace slowly looked at him. Then his mother whispered something that made Alexander's entire world stop. Son, don't fire her. Alexander stared at her. Because his mother hadn't defended anyone in months. And there was something else he didn't know. Grace wasn't simply cleaning his house. She had been praying for his mother every morning. And the secret she was about to reveal would force Alexander to question everything he thought he knew about his family. The next morning, Grace arrived at the Whitmore mansion before sunrise. She wasn't dressed like someone who expected attention. Simple clothes. Neat shoes. A small Bible tucked quietly inside her handbag. Her job was straightforward: clean the mansion, prepare breakfast, and leave. At least, that was what Alexander believed. As Grace moved through the enormous house, she noticed something everyone else had learned to ignore. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore was sitting alone beside the enormous windows, staring silently into the London morning. Her breakfast was untouched. Again. Grace stopped. "Good morning, ma'am." Eleanor didn't answer. Grace didn't force a conversation. Instead, she placed a fresh cup of tea beside her and quietly walked away. 10 minutes later, Eleanor spoke. "You're new." Grace turned. "Yes, ma'am." "What makes you think I'll drink that?" Grace smiled gently. "I don't. I just thought you might want something warm." Eleanor stared at her. For the first time in months, someone hadn't tried to fix her. They had simply stayed kind. Grace returned to cleaning. Then something unexpected happened. Eleanor picked up the cup. From the hallway, Alexander saw it. He stopped walking. His mother hadn't willingly eaten or drunk anything prepared by the household staff in weeks. But she had accepted something from Grace. Alexander said nothing. He simply watched. Later that afternoon, Grace found Eleanor struggling with an old photo album. "Would you like some help?" Eleanor hesitated. Then she opened it. Inside were photographs of Alexander as a little boy. For the first time, Eleanor's expression softened. Grace pointed at one photograph. "Is that your son?" A faint smile appeared. "Yes." What happened to that smile? Eleanor's smile disappeared. And Grace immediately realized she'd asked the wrong question. But instead of walking away, she quietly said, "Sometimes people don't lose their joy. They just get tired of carrying their pain." Eleanor looked at her. Those words landed differently. Because Grace didn't know the story. She couldn't possibly know. Or could she? That evening, Alexander returned home earlier than usual. He walked into the living room. And stopped. His mother was laughing. Actually laughing. Grace stood nearby holding the old photo album. Alexander's eyes narrowed. His mother hadn't laughed like that since before the tragedy that changed their family. And suddenly, Grace wasn't just the maid anymore. She was a question Alexander desperately wanted answered. Alexander waited until Grace left the room. Then he approached his mother. "Who is she?" Eleanor looked at him. "Grace." "I know her name." "Then why did you ask?" Alexander stared at his mother. That response alone shocked him. His mother was speaking differently. More confidently. Almost like the woman she had been years ago. "Mother, what has she been telling you?" "Nothing." "Then what has she been doing?" Eleanor looked toward the doorway where Grace had disappeared. "She listens." Alexander frowned. "That's it." "No." His mother paused. "She reminds me that God hasn't abandoned me." Alexander went silent. He had spent thousands on specialists, doctors, therapists, private retreats. Nothing had worked. Yet a maid with a Bible and a gentle voice had somehow reached the part of his mother that money couldn't touch. But Alexander wasn't convinced. That night, he called his house manager. "I want a full background check on Grace." The manager hesitated. "Sir, you heard me." Alexander didn't know why he was suspicious. Maybe because Grace seemed too calm. Maybe because his mother trusted her too quickly. Or maybe because Grace had entered a family surrounded by wealth, secrets, and old wounds, and somehow seemed completely uninterested in any of it. The following morning, Alexander watched Grace from the staircase. She didn't know he was there. She was standing beside Eleanor's chair, helping her arrange photographs. Then Grace quietly closed her eyes. "Lord, thank you for giving her another morning." Alexander's expression changed. She wasn't performing. There was no audience. No camera. No reason to pretend. Grace continued praying softly. And Eleanor reached for her hand. Alexander slowly stepped backward. But before he could leave, Grace opened her eyes. She had seen him. Their eyes met. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Grace said, "Mr. Whitmore, your mother doesn't need another person trying to control her life." Alexander's face tightened. "And what does she need?" Grace looked at Eleanor, then back at him. "Someone willing to love her without asking what she can give in return." Alexander had no answer, because those words weren't just about his mother. They were about him. And Grace knew something about the Whitmore family that Alexander had never told her. The question was, how? The question wouldn't leave Alexander's mind. How did Grace know? That evening, Alexander entered his mother's study and found her holding an old photograph. "Mother," he said quietly, "what did Grace mean?" Eleanor's fingers tightened around the photograph. "It's nothing." "Then why does she know about our family?" Eleanor looked away. Alexander stepped closer. "Mother." Silence. Then Eleanor finally whispered, "Because I told her." Alexander froze. "You told her what?" Eleanor slowly turned the photograph toward him. It showed Alexander as a young boy standing beside his father. But there was another person in the picture. A young woman. Alexander stared. He hadn't seen that photograph in years. "That's Grace's mother," Eleanor said. Alexander's expression changed instantly. "What?" His mother took a slow breath. "Years ago, before you understood what wealth meant, her mother worked for our family." Alexander stared at the photograph. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was ashamed." The room became completely silent. Eleanor revealed that Grace's mother had once helped her through the darkest period of her life. She had stayed beside Eleanor when everyone else had walked away. But when tragedy struck the Whitmore family, Eleanor pushed everyone away, including Grace's mother. And now Grace had returned. Not for money. Not for revenge. Not even for recognition. She had simply seen an elderly woman losing her joy, and decided to help. Alexander couldn't process it. "Does Grace know everything?" Eleanor shook her head. "Not everything." Alexander immediately went looking for her. He found Grace in the quiet garden behind the mansion. "Why didn't you tell me who your mother was?" Grace turned slowly. "I wasn't hired to tell you about my family." "Then why are you here?" Grace looked toward the mansion. "Because your mother needed someone." Alexander's voice softened. "You could have asked for money." Grace smiled faintly. "My mother taught me something before she died." "What?" "Never let someone else's wealth make you forget their humanity." Alexander went silent. Grace continued. "She told me that sometimes the richest people are the ones carrying the heaviest burdens." Alexander looked toward the mansion. For the first time, he wasn't seeing his mother as the powerful woman who had raised him. He was seeing her as someone who had been hurting. Then Grace said something that stopped him cold. "Mr. Whitmore, your mother isn't the only person in this house who needs healing." Alexander looked at her. "What does that mean?" Grace didn't answer. She simply walked away. And Alexander stood there wondering whether she had just seen through him too. But the greatest revelation had not yet come. 3 days later, the Whitmore mansion fell silent. Alexander received a phone call just after midnight. His mother's condition had suddenly worsened. He rushed upstairs. "Mother!" Eleanor was sitting beside her bed, trembling and overwhelmed. Alexander immediately called the family doctor. But while everyone panicked, Grace walked quietly into the room. She didn't shout. She didn't panic. She simply took Eleanor's hand.
"Mom, brate."
Eleanor looked at her. Grace began praying. "Lord, give her peace. Remind her that she is not alone." Alexander stood frozen. He had spent years trying to solve every problem with money, but there was nothing he could buy in that moment. No business deal could fix it. No expensive doctor could remove the fear. His mother reached for his hand. "Alexander." He moved closer. "Yes, Mother. I've been afraid for so long." His eyes filled with emotion. "Afraid of what?" Eleanor looked at him. "Of dying without telling you the truth." Alexander froze. Grace quietly stepped away. Eleanor continued. "Your father didn't leave because of what you believed." Alexander stared at her. "What?" His mother revealed that Alexander had spent years blaming himself for his father's departure. He had believed that his father's final argument with the family was somehow his fault. It wasn't. His father had been battling his own failures, fears, and decisions. Alexander had carried that guilt for years. And Eleanor had allowed him to carry it because she didn't know how to talk about it. Alexander's voice broke. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I thought protecting you meant keeping the truth from you." He lowered his head. All the anger, all the pressure, all the success. Suddenly, none of it mattered. Grace stood quietly nearby. Alexander looked at her. "You knew." Grace shook her head. "No." "Then how did you know I was hurting?" Grace looked at him gently. "Because hurt recognizes hurt." Alexander couldn't speak. Then Eleanor reached toward Grace. "Come here." Grace sat beside her. Eleanor held both their hands. "My son," she whispered, "you hired Grace to clean this house." Alexander looked at Grace. Eleanor smiled. "But God used her to clean something far more important." Alexander's eyes filled with tears. For the first time in years, mother and son embraced. And Grace quietly stepped back, wiping away a tear. But Alexander wasn't ready to let her disappear. Because he had finally realized something. Grace hadn't entered their home by accident. And the woman he thought had come to clean his mansion had helped uncover what money had failed to heal. Tomorrow, Alexander would make a decision that would change Grace's life forever. The woman who came to clean. The next morning, Grace packed her small handbag. She had already made her decision. She would leave the Whitmore mansion. Not because she was angry. Not because she felt unappreciated. But because she believed her work was finished. She walked downstairs for the final time. Alexander was waiting in the living room. "Where are you going?" Grace stopped. "Home." "You're quitting?" Grace nodded. "My contract is finished." Alexander stared at her. Then he noticed something on the table. A small envelope. Grace's final payment. Alexander picked it up. "You left this." "I don't need it." His expression changed. "Why?" Grace looked toward Eleanor, who was sitting by the window. "Because your mother gave me something more valuable." Alexander looked confused. "What?" Grace smiled. A reason to believe that people can smile again. Eleanor slowly stood. "Grace." Grace turned. Eleanor walked toward her. Then, without saying another word, she embraced her. Grace closed her eyes. For months, Eleanor had avoided almost everyone. Now she was holding the maid she once barely noticed. Alexander watched them. And suddenly, he understood. Grace hadn't come into their home to become wealthy. She hadn't come looking for a powerful family. She hadn't tried to impress anyone. She had simply served. She had listened. She had prayed. And she had loved someone who had nothing to offer her. Alexander picked up the envelope again. Then he tore it in half. Grace's eyes widened. "Mr. Whitmore." "Alexander." She stared at him. He smiled. After everything you've done for my mother, you still think I'm going to let you walk away with a month's salary? Grace shook her head. I didn't do it for money. I know. Alexander reached into his pocket and placed a document on the table. Grace looked at it. Her eyes widened. What is this? Your mother's old community center. Grace froze. My mother. Alexander nodded. I found out what happened to it. Grace stared at the document. Years earlier, her mother had dreamed of creating a place where struggling families could receive food, prayer, counseling, and practical support. But after her death, the project had disappeared. Alexander had found the old documents. And now, he had purchased the abandoned building. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Why? Alexander looked toward his mother. Then back at Grace. Because I spent my entire life thinking success meant owning more. He paused. You taught me that maybe success means giving more. Grace covered her mouth. Alexander continued. I want you to run it. Grace shook her head. I can't. You can. I don't have the money. You won't need it. I don't know how to manage something like that. You'll learn. Grace stared at him. Why would you trust me? Alexander smiled. Because you were the only person in this house who didn't care about what I owned. Silence. Then Eleanor spoke. And because God brought you here. Grace looked at her. Eleanor smiled. Don't you think he knew exactly what he was doing? Grace lowered her head. Tears rolled down her cheeks. For years, she had wondered why God allowed her family to struggle. Why her mother's dream had disappeared. Why she had ended up cleaning the homes of people who seemed to have everything. Now she understood. The answer hadn't arrived when she expected it. It arrived when she was ready to recognize it. Months later, the old building reopened. Above the entrance was a simple sign. The Grace Community Center. Families entered through the doors. Children received meals. Elderly people found companionship. People prayed together. And every morning, Grace stood at the entrance welcoming them. One afternoon, Alexander arrived with Eleanor. He watched his mother laughing with children. The same woman who had once barely smiled. Alexander looked at Grace. You really changed her. Grace shook her head. No. She looked toward the sky. God did. Alexander smiled. Then Eleanor took his hand. And for the first time in years, mother and son walked forward together. Grace watched them. She had entered the Whitmore mansion as a maid. But she left something far more valuable behind. She left forgiveness. She left hope. She left faith. And she discovered something she would never forget. Sometimes God sends a person into your life who looks like they are there to serve you, when in reality, God sent them to save something inside you that money could never repair. Grace thought she was cleaning a mansion. But God was cleaning hearts. And perhaps that's how God works sometimes. He doesn't always send the person you expect. Sometimes he sends the humble, the unnoticed, the person everyone else overlooks. Because what people call insignificant, God can use to change everything. Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done. Proverbs 19 verse 17. Grace came to clean a house. But God used her to restore a family. And the smile that Alexander thought his mother would never have again became the beginning of a new life for them all.